On a freezing night, Officer James Nolan hears a faint whimper coming from a dumpster during his patrol. As he approaches, he finds a helpless puppy, cold and near death. Without hesitation, he decides to save the poor creature, not knowing that this single act of kindness would change their lives forever. Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. The bitter wind whipped through the empty streets, carrying snowflakes that danced in the glow of streetlights. Officer James Nolan pulled his jacket tighter around his broad shoulders as he continued his nightly patrol. His boots crunched against the fresh dusting of snow on the pavement, the sound echoing off brick buildings that lined the deserted street. He glanced at his watch. 11:30 p.m., just 30 more minutes until his shift ended. The city felt different at this hour, wrapped in an unsettling silence that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. After 15 years on the force, James had learned to trust his instincts, and tonight, something felt off. The neon sign of Jimmy's Diner flickered weakly as he rounded the corner into the alley behind it. That's when he heard it, a small, pitiful sound, barely louder than a whisper. James stopped dead in his tracks, his trained ears focusing on the noise. There it was again, a high-pitched whimper coming from the direction of a rusty dumpster. His hand instinctively moved to rest on his flashlight as he approached. Probably just rats, he told himself, but something in his gut urged him forward. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating scattered newspapers and garbage bags around the dumpster's base. The whimper came again, weaker this time. James moved closer, pushing aside soggy newspapers and a torn trash bag. His breath caught in his throat. There, curled up in a tight ball, was a tiny puppy. Its fur was matted and dirty, its small body trembling violently in the cold. The pup's eyes were barely open, and it made no attempt to move away from the light. "Oh God," James whispered, his heart clenching at the sight. Without a second thought, he shrugged off his jacket, ignoring the biting cold that immediately cut through his uniform shirt. With gentle hands, he scooped up the fragile creature. It was so cold, too cold. The puppy didn't resist as James cradled it against his chest, wrapping his jacket around its tiny body. He could feel its shallow breathing against his hands, each breath a small victory against the frigid night air. His apartment building had a strict no pets policy, and his lifestyle wasn't exactly suited for a dog. But looking down at the helpless bundle in his arms, James knew leaving it wasn't an option. Some choices made themselves. He jogged back to his patrol car, carefully holding the puppy close to share his body heat. The keys jingled in his cold fingers as he unlocked the door and slid behind the wheel. "Hang in there, buddy," he murmured, starting the engine. The heater roared to life as James pulled away from the curb, already mapping the quickest route to the emergency vet clinic. The glass doors of the emergency veterinary clinic burst open as James rushed in, his boots leaving wet tracks on the polished floor. The receptionist jumped in her chair, startled by his sudden entrance. In his arms, wrapped in his police jacket, lay the motionless puppy, its small body barely visible in the bundle. "I found him in the trash," James said, his voice tight with urgency. "He's freezing, barely breathing." His heart hammered against his ribs as he held the tiny creature. The receptionist immediately pressed a button, and within seconds, a veterinarian in blue scrubs hurried through a side door. She quickly took the puppy from James's arms, her experienced hands already assessing the situation as she carried it through to the examination room. James followed, watching helplessly as the vet placed the puppy on a heating pad. Her movements were swift and precise as she hooked up an IV line, the needle looking enormous against the pup's thin leg. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, James could see just how bad the situation was. The puppy's ribs showed clearly through its patchy, dull fur, and its small frame seemed impossibly fragile. The vet shook her head as she worked. If you hadn't found him, he wouldn't have lasted another hour. James stood rooted to the spot, unable to tear himself away. He pulled out his phone and dialed his partner's number, asking for a favor to cover the remainder of his shift. After getting an affirmative response, he settled into one of the hard plastic chairs outside the examination room. The minutes crawled by like hours. James found himself replaying the moment in the alley over and over. The weak whimper, the cold dumpster, the newspapers. His jaw clenched as he thought about the kind of person who could throw away a living creature like it was nothing more than garbage. The clock on the wall ticked past 2 a.m., then 3 a.m. James's coffee from the clinic's vending machine had long gone cold, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. Finally, the vet emerged, looking tired but with a hint of optimism in her eyes. "He's stable for now," she said, running a hand through her hair. "It'll be touch and go, but he has a chance." James followed her into the room where the puppy lay, surrounded by monitoring equipment. The tiny creature looked even smaller against the white medical bedding, but its chest rose and fell with stronger breaths now. As James approached, the puppy's eyes fluttered open briefly, meeting his gaze. Something shifted deep inside James's chest, a feeling he couldn't quite name. Carefully, he placed his hand near the puppy's head, not quite touching, but close enough to offer comfort. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" he said softly. He sighed, knowing his apartment's strict no pets policy meant he couldn't keep the pup, but the thought of abandoning him was unbearable. "You're gonna make it, Zeus," he whispered, the name coming to him naturally. As if in response, the puppy's tail moved slightly, a weak but deliberate motion. For the first time since finding the pup, James smiled. The morning sun filtered through the clinic's windows, casting long shadows across the waiting room floor. James leaned against the counter, his uniform wrinkled from the long night. The coffee in his paper cup had gone stale hours ago, but he sipped it anyway, needing something to keep him awake. His eyes felt heavy, but the thought of leaving before knowing Zeus would be okay seemed impossible. The vet approached, her shoes squeaking softly on the linoleum floor. She held a clipboard, scanning through papers as she walked. "The good news is, he's strong," she said, looking up at James. "But he's severely malnourished and needs long-term care. This isn't going to be a quick fix." James ran a hand over his face, considering his options. His apartment building's strict no pets policy flashed through his mind, along with memories of his irregular shifts and frequent overtime. The life of a police officer wasn't exactly conducive to raising a puppy. Still, the thought of sending Zeus to a shelter made his stomach twist. "There might be another option," the vet said, seeming to read his thoughts. "There's a service dog training program that works with rescued puppies. He's young, and Labradors are excellent working dogs. If he qualifies, he'll get top-notch care and training. More importantly, he'll have a real purpose." James walked over to Zeus's kennel, where the puppy lay on soft blankets. The IV was still attached, but there was more life in those brown eyes now. Zeus's tail thumped weakly against the bedding when he saw James. The decision weighed heavily on his heart. Part of him wanted to figure out a way to keep Zeus, to give him the home he deserved. But James knew better. A cop who barely got enough sleep, living in a tiny apartment that didn't even allow pets. It wasn't fair to Zeus. With a deep breath, James nodded. "Where's the paperwork?" The vet brought over the forms, and James filled them out carefully, officially donating Zeus to the program. Each line he signed felt both right and painful. When he finished, he knelt beside Zeus's kennel. The puppy had more strength in his eyes now, a spark that wasn't there the night before. James reached through the bars, gently scratching behind Zeus's ear. His throat felt tight as he whispered, "You're going to do something great one day." Zeus pressed his head against James's hand, and James had to force himself to stand up. With one last look at the puppy who'd survived against all odds, he turned and walked away. 2 years passed, like pages turning in a well-worn book. James had traded his beat cop uniform for the specialized K9 unit, spending his days with Ace, a powerfully built German shepherd with eyes that missed nothing. Together, they'd become one of the department's most effective teams. Ace understood James's hand signals before he even finished making them, and James could read Ace's body language like a familiar map. On quiet nights during their patrols, when the city streets stretched empty before them, James's mind would sometimes drift to that snowy night 2 years ago. The image of a tiny, shivering puppy would surface, and he'd wonder about Zeus. Had he made it through the training program? Did someone give him a good home? Sometimes the not knowing gnawed at him, but he never looked into it. Part of him feared learning that Zeus hadn't survived, that all his hopes for the puppy's future had been in vain. The call came in on a Tuesday evening, a burglary in progress. James and Ace responded immediately, their patrol car's sirens cutting through the evening air. The suspect's vehicle peeled away as they arrived, triggering a chase that sent them weaving through city streets. The pursuit ended in an abandoned parking lot where the suspect opened fire. Ace moved like lightning, taking down the armed man with practiced precision, but not before a bullet whizzed past James's head, close enough that he felt its heat. The near miss left his shoulder aching from how quickly he'd thrown himself behind cover. Later that night, James sat in his apartment, pressing an ice pack to his sore shoulder. Ace lay at his feet, ever vigilant, even in rest. The room was quiet except for the hum of the heating system and Ace's steady breathing. James had just decided to call it a night when his phone rang, its sharp tone cutting through the silence. The number wasn't one he recognized. "Officer Nolan speaking," he answered, his voice still carrying the professional tone from his shift. "Officer Nolan, we need a search and rescue dog immediately for an urgent missing child case." The voice was clipped, urgent. "Your usual partner is out, so we're assigning you a temporary one." James frowned, glancing down at Ace. "Who?" There was a brief pause on the line. Then, "His name's Zeus." The words hit James like a physical force. His fingers tightened around the phone as memories flooded back. The dumpster, the tiny cold body, those first moments when Zeus's eyes had opened in the vet clinic. The room suddenly felt too small, too confined. 2 years of wondering, and now fate had thrown them back together. That helpless puppy he'd rescued was now a working dog, a professional like Ace. Pride swelled in his chest, mixing with disbelief in a surge of anticipation that made his heart race. James swallowed hard, finding his voice. "I'm on my way." James's patrol car pulled into the K9 unit facility's parking lot, the engine's rumble matching his racing heartbeat. The facility's floodlights cast harsh shadows across the training yard, where handlers were preparing their dogs for the night's assignments. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel before he cut the engine. Stepping out into the cool night air, James scanned the yard. Groups of handlers moved with purpose, checking equipment and reviewing protocols. But his eyes searched for just one dog among the many. His throat felt dry, memories of that snowy night 2 years ago flooding back. A handler in a Navy uniform approached from the far end of the yard, leading a chocolate Labrador on a professional-grade lead. James's feet rooted to the spot. The sight knocked the wind from his lungs. Gone was the skeletal, dying puppy he'd pulled from that dumpster. In its place stood a magnificent animal, strong, alert, and carrying himself with unmistakable purpose. Zeus's coat gleamed under the lights, healthy and thick. A service harness hugged his muscular frame, the official K9 unit patches catching the light. His amber eyes held a sharp intelligence as he walked in perfect heel position beside his handler. Because James watched, Zeus maintained his disciplined composure, every inch the professional working dog. But as James took a step closer, Zeus's ears twitched forward. The lab's nose lifted, testing the air. Then those intelligent eyes locked onto James's face. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then Zeus's tail began to wag, a steady, controlled movement that spoke of recognition. The handler laughed softly. "Well, would you look at that? Looks like he remembers you." James knelt down, his heart thundering in his chest. "Hey, buddy," he said softly, extending his hand. Zeus stepped forward, pressing his head into James's palm. The fur was soft and warm under his fingers, so different from that cold night, yet somehow exactly the same. There was no mistaking it. The connection was still there, a thread that 2 years hadn't managed to break. Zeus's tail wagged harder as James scratched behind his ears, exactly where he used to love it as a puppy. The moment was broken by a sharp whistle from the command center. The handler straightened. "Briefing starting. We've got a critical situation." Inside, the atmosphere turned grave as they gathered around a tactical map. Photos of a small boy with bright eyes and tousled hair were passed around. Liam Johnson, age 6, missing for over 24 hours. The clock was ticking, and as James looked at Zeus, now sitting alertly at attention, he knew this dog might be their best hope of finding him alive. The search team's vehicles pulled up to the wooded area, their tires crunching on gravel. James stepped out, Zeus at his side, taking in the scene. Police tape cordoned off a small playground where Liam was last seen. Beyond it stretched acres of dense forest, dark and forbidding in the late afternoon light. Liam's parents huddled near a police cruiser, the mother clutching a small blue sweater. Her eyes were red and swollen, while the father paced, running his hands through his disheveled hair. James felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders as he watched them. Every minute counted in cases like these. "Mrs. Johnson," James approached gently, Zeus staying perfectly at heel. "We need something with Liam's scent. The sweater would be perfect." The mother nodded quickly, holding out the garment with trembling hands. "He was wearing it yesterday morning, before ... Her voice cracked. James took the sweater carefully, then knelt beside Zeus. "Okay, buddy, find him." He held the sweater near Zeus's nose, watching as the lab took deep, purposeful sniffs. Suddenly, Zeus's body went rigid, his head lifting, his nostrils flared as he processed the scent, and then he let out a sharp, commanding bark that cut through the forest silence. "He's got something," James called out, and the search team snapped to attention. Zeus moved with incredible precision, his nose working the ground in practice patterns. James had worked with many canines before, but Zeus's focus was remarkable. The lab weaved through the trees, never losing the trail, despite the rough terrain. After 20 minutes, Zeus veered sharply left, away from the main search grid. The other officers exchanged uncertain glances. "That's outside our projected area, Lieutenant," Daniel said, consulting his map. "The suspect's known routes all lead north." James looked at Zeus, who stood waiting, tail straight, eyes fixed on the new direction. The dog's body language screamed certainty. James remembered the tiny pup who'd fought to survive, who'd never given up. That same determination shone in Zeus's eyes now. Protocol said to stick to the search grid. Logic said the suspect wouldn't have gone this way, but something deeper, something born of trust and instinct, told James to believe in Zeus. "Let's go," James said firmly, adjusting his tactical vest. Zeus has got the scent. They pushed on as darkness crept in, flashlight beams cutting through the growing gloom. Zeus never wavered, leading them through thick underbrush and over fallen logs. After another hour of hiking, the trees began to thin. Zeus slowed his pace, his movements becoming more cautious. An old farmhouse emerged from the darkness, its weathered boards barely visible beneath thick curtains of ivy. Half of the roof had caved in, and the windows were black holes in the rotting walls. James felt his gut twist as he realized this location wasn't anywhere on their search grid. Zeus stopped at the edge of the overgrown yard, his ears flattened against his head, and a low warning growl rumbled in his chest. James's hand instinctively moved to his weapon. Something was definitely here. James raised his fist, signaling the team to halt. Zeus stood alert at his side as they approached the farmhouse's sagging porch. The wooden steps groaned under their weight despite their careful movements. Inside, their flashlight beams cut through thick clouds of dust, revealing peeling wallpaper and debris scattered across warped floorboards. The smell hit them immediately, a heavy mix of mildew and rotting wood that made James's nose wrinkle. "Clear the rooms," James whispered. The team split up, checking each corner with practiced efficiency. Zeus moved differently now, his nose working overtime, pacing in tight circles near the center of what must have been a living room. Suddenly, he stopped and let out 3 sharp barks, his paws scratching at the floorboards. James hurried over, kneeling beside his partner. He pressed his palm against the wooden planks, feeling the subtle difference in resistance. "It's hollow underneath," he called out softly. The team gathered around as James and another officer worked their fingers into the edges of the boards. With a crack of splitting wood, they pried them up, revealing a dark space below. Cold, damp air wafted up from the opening. James's flashlight beam illuminated rough-hewn steps descending into darkness. There at the top of the stairs sat a small tennis shoe. James picked it up with trembling fingers. It matched the description of what Liam had been wearing when he disappeared. "He's down there," James breathed, his heart pounding. Zeus whined softly, already positioning himself to lead the way down. The stairs creaked as they descended into the cellar. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting sickly yellow light that flickered erratically. The space was cluttered with old tools hanging from rusty nails and dirty blankets piled in corners. Zeus froze, then darted toward the far corner. James's flashlight beam followed, landing on a small figure curled up on the floor. Liam lay motionless, his face ghostly pale in the weak light. Zeus reached the boy first, whining as he gently nudged Liam's cheek with his nose. James dropped to his knees beside them, fingers quickly finding the pulse point on Liam's neck. It was there, weak and thready, but present. The relief flooding through James's body was cut short by a loud creak from the floorboards above. The team's heads snapped up in unison. Someone else was in the house. The heavy thud of footsteps echoed from above, and James's hand instinctively moved to his holster. His team froze, eyes fixed on the ceiling, as dust filtered down with each step. They were trapped in the cellar with an unconscious child and nowhere to go. James pulled out his radio, keeping his voice low. "Dispatch, this is Officer Nolan. We need immediate backup at the old Thompson farmhouse." Only static answered. The thick walls and underground location were blocking the signal. A metallic screech cut through the silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of a lock sliding into place. Someone was sealing the trapdoor. Zeus's ears shot up, his body tensing as he positioned himself in front of Liam's still form. A deep growl rumbled in his chest, his training kicking in as he sensed the immediate threat. James surveyed their options. The cellar walls were solid concrete, and the only exit was the way they'd come in. He carefully lifted Liam, cradling the boy's small body against his chest. "Stay with me, buddy," he whispered as Liam stirred slightly, letting out a weak moan. The team started moving toward the stairs, weapons drawn. Suddenly, the trapdoor flew open with a bang. A figure appeared in the opening, silhouetted against the dim light from above. The glint of a knife blade caught in their flashlight beams. Before anyone could react, Zeus launched himself up the stairs. His powerful muscles propelled him through the air as he crashed into the attacker with tremendous force. The knife clattered across the floor as Zeus's teeth found purchase. James didn't hesitate. He passed Liam to another officer and lunged forward, tackling the struggling man. They hit the ground hard and James quickly pinned him down, securing his hands behind his back. The sound of sirens pierced the night air as backup finally arrived. Officers swarmed the farmhouse, securing every entrance and exit. As they dragged the suspect to his feet, James recognized him from wanted bulletins. A trafficker connected to a notorious ring they'd been tracking for months. Outside, paramedics rushed forward with a stretcher. Liam was carefully loaded into the ambulance, oxygen mask already in place. His color was starting to improve. James knelt beside Zeus, who sat watching the scene unfold with alert eyes. He ran his through the dog's thick fur, feeling the strong heartbeat beneath. Zeus turned to look at him, his tail wagging despite his obvious exhaustion. "You saved his life," James whispered, scratching behind Zeus's ears. The dog, who had once been thrown away like garbage, had just helped bring a lost child home. The farmhouse buzzed with activity as forensic teams combed every inch of the property. Blue and red lights from police vehicles painted the night in alternating colors, casting long shadows across the overgrown yard. James stood near his patrol car, Zeus sitting alertly by his side, as they watched Liam wrapped in an emergency blanket, finally safe in his mother's arms. My baby," Liam's mother repeated through her tears, holding him close. The boy's color had improved since they'd found him in the dark cellar, though his eyes still held a haunted look that made James's chest tighten. Two officers led Victor Hayes toward a waiting police car. The trafficker's face was bruised from his encounter with Zeus, but a smug smile played at his lips. James approached him, keeping his voice steady despite the anger burning in his gut. "Why Liam? Why this farmhouse?" Hayes just smirked, his silence more unsettling than any answer could have been. Zeus growled low in his throat, picking up on James's tension. The dog's ears twitched back and forth, his body rigid with alertness. Detective Laura Mitchell from Missing Persons strode over, her face grim. She'd been working child disappearance cases for the past 3 years, and James had never seen her look this concerned. "Officer Nolan," she said, pulling him aside, "that instinct of yours to follow Zeus off-grid, it just opened up something bigger than we imagined." She pulled out her tablet, showing him a series of case files. 5 other children have disappeared in the last 2 years. Same pattern, taken from public places, no witnesses, no demands. James studied the files, his stomach dropping. And you think they're connected? The locations where they were taken form a pattern. This farmhouse? It's right in the middle of it all. She zoomed in on a map showing red dots where each child had vanished. We've been looking for these kids for months, but nothing ever stuck. Until now. James looked back at Liam, now being checked over by paramedics. The boy was one of the lucky ones. They'd gotten to him in time. But those other children? His fists clenched at his sides. Zeus pressed against his leg, offering silent support. One rescue wasn't enough. They needed to find the others and shut down whoever was behind this, once and for all. James spread the case files across his desk, the harsh fluorescent lights of the precinct making his tired eyes ache. Zeus lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head to watch his handler's movements. Detective Mitchell had brought in boxes of evidence from the other missing children cases, and the team had been working non-stop for hours. "Look at this," Officer Daniel said, pointing to her computer screen. Every single abduction happened within a 5-block radius of properties owned by Horizon Development Group. James leaned in, studying the map. Red pins marked each kidnapping site, forming an unsettling pattern around various buildings, warehouses, apartment complexes, and abandoned lots. Horizon's just a front, Detective Mitchell confirmed, dropping another stack of papers on the desk. They own dozens of properties across the city, but their financial records don't add up. No real business activity, just property holdings. As James pulled up the company records on his computer, Zeus suddenly sat up, his ears perking forward, the dog's eyes fixed on the screen, a low growl rumbling in his throat. "What's wrong, buddy?" James frowned, scrolling through the document. Then he saw it, an address that made his blood run cold. One of Horizon's properties was a former service dog training facility, abandoned 3 years ago. It was less than a mile from the alley where he'd found Zeus. James's hands trembled slightly as he pulled up Zeus's rescue file. The dates aligned perfectly. Zeus had been found just weeks after the facility closed down. "Zeus," James whispered, reaching down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "Were you part of this?" The thought made him sick. Had they thrown Zeus away because he wouldn't serve their purposes? Had he escaped? Zeus whined softly, pressing his head against James's leg. The dog's usual confident demeanor shifted, showing a vulnerability James hadn't seen since that night in the veterinary clinic. Detective Mitchell noticed the change in both handler and dog. "What did you find?" Before James could answer, Daniel burst into the room. "Hayes is talking," she announced. "He's asking for you, Nolan." James found Hayes in the interrogation room, looking far too pleased with himself for someone in handcuffs. The trafficker's smirk widened as James entered. "Finally figured it out, did you?" Hayes leaned back in his chair. "Took you long enough." "The training facility," James said, keeping his voice steady. "How many other places like that do you have?" Hayes' eyes glinted. "You think you stopped something big? Found some master plan?" He let out a harsh laugh. "You're too late." James's heart pounded against his ribs. The way Hayes said it, the certainty in his voice, could only mean one thing. Another child was already targeted. The call about Sophie Lewis came in just after dawn. James's heart sank as he listened to the details. 9 years old, last seen at Lincoln Elementary during morning recess. The description matched the pattern perfectly. Young, vulnerable, taken from a location near a Horizon-owned property. "We've got less than 12 hours, Detective Mitchell announced, pinning Sophie's photo to the board. "After that, they'll move her out of the city." James grabbed Zeus's lead, his fingers tightening around the leather. "We're heading to the school. Send everything you have to my phone." At Lincoln Elementary, panicked parents huddled behind police tape while officers combed the playground. Zeus's nose twitched as James held out Sophie's purple backpack, found abandoned by the swing set. "Find her, boy," James whispered. Zeus sniffed deeply, then jerked forward with purpose. James followed as the dog weaved through the streets, heading toward the industrial district. They passed warehouses and loading docks until Zeus stopped abruptly, hackles raised. A white delivery van sat idling in a vacant lot. The driver, a thin man with a jagged scar across his neck, tensed visibly when he spotted them. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. James reached for his radio, but Zeus's sudden growl made him freeze. The engine revved. They were out of time. In one fluid motion, James unclipped Zeus's leash. "Get him!" Zeus launched forward like a bullet, diving through the van's open side door. The driver's scream pierced the air as Zeus's teeth found his arm, dragging him away from the wheel. James sprinted to the van, gun drawn. In the back, huddled behind some boxes, he found Sophie. She was pale and trembling, but alive. "It's okay," he soothed, helping her out. "You're safe now." Backup arrived minutes later. As they led the driver away in handcuffs, James knew this wasn't over. This man was just another Calder, a pawn in a bigger game. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. "Walk away, Officer Nolan," a distorted voice hissed. "Or next time, it won't be a rescue. It'll be a body." The warning call left James' hands shaking as he set down his phone. He stared at the device, his mind racing. Someone was watching his every move, knew exactly who he was. The voice, though distorted, carried authority. This wasn't just another street thug making empty threats. At his feet, Zeus whined softly, picking up on his handler's distress. James absently scratched behind the dog's ears while pulling up files on his computer. The Shell Corporation, Horizon Holdings, was a maze of paperwork and false leads. But deep in the financial records, a pattern emerged. All decisions traced back to a single figure known only as the Ghost. "No real name, no face, nothing," James muttered, scrolling through empty databases. Zeus's head suddenly perked up at a knock on the door. "Officer Nolan?" A clerk entered with a thick manila envelope. "Those service dog records you requested finally came through." James tore open the envelope, spreading the documents across his desk. His eyes scanned training evaluations, health records, and intake forms until something made him stop cold. Zeus's intake form listed him as Specimen 23, part of a larger group of puppies acquired through private donation. But the attached police report told a different story. Multiple reports of stolen puppies in the area, all around the same time Zeus was found. Some puppies were recovered from a training facility. Others, like Zeus, had been dumped when deemed unsuitable. James's heart pounded as he connected the dots. The trafficking ring wasn't just targeting children. They were running a parallel operation with dogs, training the suitable ones, discarding the rest like garbage. His hands trembled as he pulled up property records for the training facility where Zeus had been abandoned. The owner's name jumped off the screen: Horizon Holdings. James slumped back in his chair, the weight of the revelation hitting him hard. Zeus placed his head on James's knee, those intelligent eyes somehow knowing. "This isn't just about kids," James whispered, running a hand through his hair. "It's about everyone they see as property." He looked down at Zeus, seeing him in a completely new light. The dog wasn't just a survivor of their cruelty. He was living proof of their operation, a witness who could help bring down the entire network. Zeus's tail thumped against the floor, his steady gaze never leaving James' face. In that moment, James realized their partnership wasn't just chance, it was destiny. James stood before the evidence board in the K9 unit office, his eyes tracing the red strings, connecting photos and documents. The web of evidence was extensive. Surveillance photos of known trafficking locations, property records for Horizon Holdings, and in the center, a question mark representing the mysterious figure known as the Ghost. Zeus paced anxiously at his feet, letting out occasional whines. The dog had been on edge all morning, his usual calm demeanor replaced with nervous energy. James glanced down at his partner, noting how Zeus's ears twitched at every sound. "What's got you so worked up, buddy?" James murmured, but Zeus just continued his restless movement. Turning back to his desk, James pulled up the original police report from the night he found Zeus. He'd read it dozens of times before, but something told him to look again. His eyes moved methodically over each detail: the time, the weather conditions, the exact location. The location. James sat up straighter, his pulse quickening. The alley where he'd found Zeus had been behind Joe's diner, but the report included the full property details. The diner was just a front unit. Behind it stood a massive warehouse that took up most of the block. James's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up property records. His breath caught in his throat. The warehouse was owned by a subsidiary of Horizon Holdings. Zeus wasn't randomly abandoned there. Someone had deliberately dumped him behind their own property. The realization hit James like a physical blow. Zeus's whining grew more intense, as if he understood what James had discovered. "They threw you away right in their own backyard," James said quietly, his jaw tightening with anger. They were that confident nobody would connect the dots. Without hesitation, James slammed his laptop shut and grabbed Zeus's leash from his desk drawer. Zeus's ears perked up immediately, his body tensing with anticipation. "We're going back," James announced, clipping the leash to Zeus's harness. They needed to see that alley again, this time with fresh eyes and the full picture of what they were dealing with. The night air was bitter as James and his tactical team approached the abandoned warehouse. Their flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing graffiti-covered walls and broken windows. Zeus moved silently beside James, his muscles tense and alert. "Team 1, take the west entrance. Team 2, with me on the loading dock," James whispered into his radio. The officers spread out, their movements precise and practiced. The warehouse loomed before them, a hulking shadow against the starless sky. As they neared the loading dock, Zeus suddenly froze. His nose twitched rapidly, and a low, threatening growl rumbled in his chest. James had learned to trust that sound. It meant trouble. "He's got something," James murmured to his team. Zeus pulled forward, leading them toward the rusted loading dock doors. The metal groaned as they pushed them open, revealing a vast, dark space inside. Their flashlights illuminated floating dust particles and abandoned machinery. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. James felt Zeus's leash go taut as the dog's attention fixed on something in the darkness. Then they heard it, a soft, muffled whimper that made James's skin crawl. "Fan out," he ordered, his voice barely above a whisper. The team moved in formation, weapons ready. Zeus pulled James toward a mountain of wooden crates stacked against the far wall. The dog's behavior grew more intense, his body rigid with purpose. James ran his flashlight over the crates. They looked ordinary enough, but Zeus wouldn't back down. "Help me with these," James called to the nearest officers. Together, they began moving the crates aside, revealing something that made James' heart skip. A heavy metal trap door set into the concrete floor. Before James could give an order, Zeus started scratching frantically at the door, his claws scraping against the metal. His usual disciplined demeanor had given way to desperate urgency. "There's something down there," James muttered, gesturing to an officer with a crowbar. The team worked quickly to break the heavy padlock securing the door. When the door finally creaked open, the beam of James's flashlight revealed a nightmare. The underground room was lined with metal cages, stacked too high against the concrete walls. Weak whimpers and frightened growls echoed from several of them, where dogs lay curled up, thin, scared, and clearly neglected. But what made James' blood run cold was the cage in the far corner. There, huddled against the metal bars, was a small child. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 years old. His eyes were wide with terror as the flashlight beam found him, and he tried to make himself even smaller in the corner of his cage. James felt the rage building in his chest. This wasn't just an animal trafficking operation, it was something far more sinister. The warehouse wasn't abandoned at all. It was a holding facility, hiding its dark secrets underground. The underground room erupted into controlled chaos as officers moved swiftly between the cages. The sound of metal locks being cut filled the air, mixed with the whimpers of frightened dogs and the quiet reassurances of rescue workers. James approached the boy's cage carefully, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. Zeus stayed close, his presence somehow calming the child who hadn't taken his eyes off the dog since they'd found him. "Hey there," James said softly, kneeling down as another officer worked on the lock. "We're here to help you. You're safe now." The boy clutched a dirty stuffed bear to his chest, his knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. As the cage door swung open, James noticed something odd about the toy, a small patch sewn into its leg. It wasn't a typical manufacturer's label, but rather an intricate symbol he'd seen before. His heart began to race as he recognized the insignia from evidence photos of previous trafficking cases. The boy wouldn't let anyone touch him except Zeus, who gently nuzzled his hand. The dog's presence seemed to give him courage, and for the first time since they'd found him, the child's lips began to move. "They're coming back," he whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. The words sent a chill down James's spine. James shared a sharp look with his team. If the traffickers were returning to check on their cargo, they were all in serious danger. The rescue operation had just become a race against time. As if confirming their worst fears, the radios crackled to life. Multiple vehicles approaching from the north. Came the urgent warning: hostiles inbound. James's training kicked in immediately. "Everyone move." "Now," he ordered, his voice firm but controlled. "Get the dogs and the boy topside. Emergency evac protocol." Officers quickly but carefully began guiding the rescued dogs up the narrow stairs. Some animals could walk, while others had to be carried. Zeus stationed himself protectively beside the boy, who still wouldn't let go of his bear. Through the open trapdoor above, James could see flashlight beams dancing across the warehouse ceiling. The sound of approaching engines grew louder. Headlights swept across the building's broken windows, casting long shadows through the dusty air. They were almost out of time. The warehouse doors burst open as three men strode in, their footsteps echoing through the cavernous space. They moved with the confidence of people who thought they owned the place, completely unaware of the trap they'd walked into. James's voice rang out clear and firm through the darkness. "Police, drop your weapons. This place is shut down." The beam of his flashlight illuminated the startled faces of the traffickers. For a split second, nobody moved. Then one of the men reached for his waistband, pulling out a handgun with practiced speed. The warehouse exploded into chaos. The sharp crack of gunfire filled the air as bullets pinged off metal and splintered wood. James and his team ducked behind wooden crates, returning fire with controlled precision. Through the mayhem, James spotted movement near the trapdoor. One of the traffickers had circled around, making a grab for the terrified boy. The child screamed as rough hands seized his arm. Something snapped inside James. His blood boiled at the sight of the boy being dragged away. Without hesitation, he gave Zeus the signal they'd trained countless hours for. Zeus launched forward like a missile, his powerful muscles propelling him through the air. His jaws clamped down on the trafficker's forearm with crushing force. The man let out an agonized howl, his grip on the boy instantly releasing. The trafficker thrashed wildly, trying to shake Zeus off, but the dog held firm. His training kicked in perfectly. He wasn't letting go until ordered to do so. The man's face contorted with pain as he stumbled backward, Zeus's weight pulling him off balance. James seized the opportunity. He sprinted forward, tackling the trafficker to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of the man, and James quickly twisted his arms behind his back. The cold steel of handcuffs clicked into place. "Zeus, release," James commanded. Zeus immediately let go, positioning himself between the subdued trafficker and the boy, who had scrambled to safety behind a stack of crates. Around them, the firefight was ending. The other officers had successfully subdued the remaining traffickers. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the warehouse as the last criminal was secured. James surveyed the scene, his heart still racing. The rescued dogs were safe, being loaded into animal control vehicles outside. The boy was being checked over by paramedics, Zeus sitting vigilantly by his side. Evidence teams were already starting their work, photographing and documenting everything in the warehouse. But even as he watched the traffickers being led away in cuffs, James couldn't shake the tension in his gut. During processing, each criminal had mentioned the same name when questioned about their boss, the Ghost. The mastermind behind it all was still out there, pulling strings from the shadows. James sat at his desk, watching through the one-way glass as officers processed the warehouse traffickers. The suspects slouched in their chairs, some defiant, others nervous, but all of them keeping their mouths shut about their boss. The victory felt hollow without the mastermind in custody. Zeus lay at James's feet, his ears perking up occasionally at the sounds of movement in the station. James absently scratched behind the dog's ears while reviewing the preliminary reports from the raid. "Let's see what these guys were carrying," James muttered, spreading out the evidence bags containing the traffickers' phones. His team huddled around computers, working to crack passwords and access data that might lead them to the Ghost. Officer Daniel called out from her station. "Got something here, James." She waved him over, pointing to her screen. This one had an encrypted message that came through right before we hit the warehouse. James leaned in, his eyes scanning the decoded text. Clean up, move assets, eliminate the officer. The words made his stomach clench. He'd known the ghost was dangerous, but this was different. This was personal. The mastermind wasn't just operating from the shadows anymore. He was actively watching them. Zeus suddenly stood up, sensing the change in James's tension. The dog's tail stopped wagging, his body alert and ready. "Sir!" Officer Thompson burst into the, "We have a situation." He paused to catch his breath. "The security system at your home. It just went dark. All cameras are disabled." James's blood ran cold. He grabbed his jacket and Zeus's leash in one fluid motion. "Let's go, boy," he commanded, and Zeus fell into step beside him as they rushed toward the parking lot. The drive home felt endless, even with the sirens blaring. James's knuckles were white on the steering wheel as he navigated traffic. Zeus stood tensely in the back seat, picking up on his handler's anxiety. When they finally pulled up to his apartment building, everything looked normal. Too normal. No signs of forced entry, no suspicious vehicles. But James knew better. Years of police work had taught him that the quietest scenes often held the worst surprises. They took the stairs two at a time until they reached his floor. At the end of the hallway, James' apartment door stood slightly ajar, a silent warning that someone had been inside. James edged into his apartment, gun raised, his back against the wall. Zeus moved silently beside him, the dog's muscles coiled and ready. The darkness felt thick, oppressive, broken only by strips of streetlight filtering through the blinds. "Clear," James whispered as they checked each room methodically. The living room showed signs of intrusion, cushions slightly askew, papers shuffled. In his bedroom, drawers had been carefully searched, everything replaced almost perfectly. Almost. The kitchen was last. James's finger stayed steady on the trigger as he swept the beam of his flashlight across the space. Nothing seemed missing, but something was different. His eyes landed on the kitchen table and his heart skipped a beat. There, placed with deliberate precision in the center, lay a single brass bullet. Beneath it was a photograph, one taken just days ago of James and Zeus at the canine training facility. James remembered the moment clearly. They'd just completed a successful training exercise. Zeus looked proud, alert, his coat gleaming in the sun. James had been smiling, one hand resting on Zeus's head. James's grip tightened on his gun as he stared at the stage scene. The message was clear. The ghost knew everything about them, had been watching them. This wasn't just business anymore. This was a threat. Zeus growled softly, his eyes fixed on the dark corners of the room. The sudden buzz of a phone cut through the silence, making them both jump. An unknown number flashed on the screen. James stood there, his heart pounding. 3 rings. 4. On the 5th, he answered, putting it on speaker. "Hello?" His voice was steady, controlled. "Officer Nolan," the voice was distorted, mechanical. "I trust you got my message." "Crystal clear," James replied, his jaw clenched. "Why don't we meet face to face? End this now." A low, modulated chuckle crackled through the speaker. "Walk away, Officer Nolan. You're in over your head." James's free hand found Zeus's fur, drawing strength from the dog's solid presence. Not a chance. The voice turned cold, all traces of amusement gone. "Then Zeus dies first." The line went dead, leaving James in suffocating silence. His hand dropped from Zeus's head, and he stared at the loyal dog who'd been through so much with him. Zeus looked back, unwavering, ready to face whatever came next. James's blood ran cold as the reality sank in. The ghost wasn't just targeting him anymore. He was going after Zeus, the one partner James couldn't bear to lose. James gathered his team in the precinct's conference room, their faces grim under the fluorescent lights. Maps and surveillance photos covered the walls, evidence of the ghost's operation. They had to move fast before he struck again. "He's watching us," James said, his hand resting on Zeus's head. "So let's give him something to see." The plan was simple but risky. They would plant false information on one of the seized phones from the warehouse raid, an encrypted message about Zeus being injured during a training exercise and requiring immediate relocation to a specialist facility. If the ghost is as obsessed with Zeus as we think, James explained, he'll send someone to intercept during transport. The team chose an abandoned parking garage on the outskirts of town as their staging ground. It was perfect, multiple entry points, good sight lines, and plenty of cover for their undercover officers. As night fell, James and Zeus waited in position, hidden behind a concrete pillar. Other officers were scattered throughout the structure, weapons ready. The garage was eerily quiet except for the distant hum of city traffic. 1 hour passed, then 2. James' muscles ached from staying still, but Zeus remained alert beside him, ears twitching at every small sound. Just when doubt started creeping in, Zeus tensed. Headlights swept across the garage walls as a black SUV rolled in, moving slowly between the concrete pillars. The vehicle stopped, and 3 men stepped out. They moved with military precision, scanning the area. James' breath caught when he saw what one of them was carrying. Not a gun, but a syringe. They weren't here to kill Zeus. They wanted to take him alive. James waited until the men were in position before giving the signal. Now! The garage erupted into controlled chaos. Officers emerged from their hiding spots, weapons drawn. Police! Drop your weapons! The men tried to fight back, but they were outnumbered and surrounded. Zeus launched at one of them, taking him down hard. Within minutes, all 3 were in handcuffs. At the station, the men stayed silent until one of them cracked under interrogation. Zeus was never meant to be abandoned, he admitted, his voice shaking. He was property, the ghost property. James felt his pulse spike as the truth finally emerged. The ghost didn't just want him dead, he wanted Zeus back. The puppy James had rescued that snowy night had never been trash to throw away. He'd been stolen merchandise. Zeus pressed against James's leg, as if sensing his handler's distress. James looked down at his partner, remembering the tiny shivering pup he'd found in that dumpster. Everything made sense now. Why Zeus had been discarded near the warehouse. Why the ghost had been watching them so closely. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming what the ghost believed belonged to him. James sat at his desk, surrounded by case files and evidence photos. His eyes burned from staring at documents for hours, but everything was finally falling into place. Zeus lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head to check on his partner. It was never about abandonment, James muttered, spreading out the documents. You were merchandise. The evidence painted a disturbing picture. The ghost operation wasn't just trafficking children. It was a sophisticated network that included breeding and training animals for criminal enterprises. Dogs like Zeus were meant to be sold to high-level criminals, trained for security or worse. James found records of specialized training facilities hidden behind legitimate businesses. Zeus's paperwork showed he'd been part of their early program, but something had gone wrong. You were too sick, James said, reaching down to scratch behind Zeus's ears. Or maybe you just wouldn't follow their commands, so they threw you away. The ghost organization had made a critical error. They'd assumed a malnourished puppy wouldn't survive a winter night in that dumpster. Instead, James had found him. Zeus hadn't just lived, he'd thrived, becoming exactly what the ghost feared most, a highly trained police dog with intimate knowledge of their operation. Detective Daniel entered the office, carrying a fresh stack of files. We found something interesting, she said, laying out satellite photos. This private airstrip keeps showing up in our investigation. It's registered to one of the ghost's shell companies. James leaned forward, studying the images. The airstrip was remote, surrounded by warehouses and hangars. Perfect for moving merchandise without attracting attention. Look at these manifests, Daniel continued. Every time a child went missing, there was a private flight within 48 hours. Zeus suddenly stood, his attention fixed on one of the photos. His tail went still, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. James picked up the image. It showed a concrete building near the runway. What is it, boy? You recognize this place? Zeus's reaction was answer enough. This wasn't just another location in their investigation. This was where it all started, where dogs like Zeus were trained before being sold to criminals. The ghost doesn't just want to eliminate a threat, James realized, his voice tight. He wants to use you. Your training, your skills, you're still valuable to him. The pieces aligned with terrible clarity. The ghost wasn't running a simple trafficking ring. He was building an empire, using both children and animals as commodities. And now that Zeus was a fully trained police dog, he was worth more than ever. The airstrip wasn't just a transport hub, it was the ghost base of operations. Every piece of evidence, every lead, every connection led back to that remote landing strip outside the city. James and his team crouched behind a ridge overlooking the private airstrip, their surveillance equipment trained on the tarmac below. Through his binoculars, he watched as another cargo plane touched down, its engines humming in the dark night. Zeus lay beside him, belly to the ground, his muscles tense and ready. Movement at the east gate, Officer Rodriguez whispered through the radio. 3 SUVs approaching. James adjusted his view. The vehicles were sleek and black, definitely not the usual cargo handlers. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, far more security than a legitimate shipping operation would need. Zeus's ears twitched, and he let out a nearly inaudible whine. James placed a steadying hand on the dog's back, feeling the slight tremor running through his partner's body. "I know, boy, we're close." The team had been monitoring the airstrip for 3 days, documenting every arrival and departure. The pattern was clear. Shipments arrived under cover of darkness, with armed escorts and minimal paper trail. As they watched, a new figure emerged from one of the SUVs. Even from this distance, his expensive suit and commanding presence stood out. Eric Daniels, CEO of multiple charitable foundations and, as they'd recently discovered, the ghost's primary financial connection. "That's Locke," Detective Daniel confirmed through the radio. "Intel confirms he's been laundering money through his foundations for years. Every donation, every charity event. It's all a front for the ghost trafficking operation." James watched as Locke strode across the tarmac, greeting the armed guards like old friends. His public persona was impeccable. A wealthy philanthropist dedicated to children's causes. The truth made James's stomach turn. Locke wasn't helping children, he was selling them. The evidence they'd gathered painted a disturbing picture. Locke's connections reached into local government, law enforcement, even international shipping authorities. He made sure both human and animal cargo moved without questions, while the ghost orchestrated everything from the shadows. "Sir?" Rodriguez's voice crackled again. "Strike teams are in position. SWAT is standing by." James checked his watch. In 20 minutes, 3 more planes were scheduled to land. According to their intelligence, this was the ghost's biggest shipment yet. Children and trained animals all being moved at once. Zeus's head suddenly snapped up, his attention fixed on something in the distance. James followed his gaze to a small hangar on the far side of the airstrip. A light had flickered on inside. "All units," James whispered into his radio. "This is it. The ghost has to be here somewhere. When those planes land, we move." He looked down at Zeus, whose amber eyes reflected the determination James felt in his own heart. They'd started this journey together, a discarded puppy and a lonely cop. Now they were about to bring down the entire operation that had once thrown Zeus away. The first of the 3 expected planes appeared on the horizon, its landing lights piercing the darkness. James signaled his team to get ready. They had one shot at this. If the ghost slipped away tonight, he'd disappear forever, taking his network of corruption with him. The raid exploded into action as tactical teams breached the airstrip from multiple directions. Flashlights cut through the darkness and shouts of, "Police! Get down!" echoed across the tarmac. James and Zeus moved as one, staying low as they advanced through the chaos. Gunfire erupted from the armed guards. James ducked behind a fuel truck. Zeus pressed against his leg. The dog's breathing was steady, focused. Years of training had prepared them both for moments like this. "East hangar secured," a voice crackled through James's radio. "Multiple suspects in custody." James signaled to his team, then sprinted toward the nearest cargo plane. Zeus took point, leading the way up the metal stairs into the aircraft's belly. The smell hit them first: fear, sweat, and desperation. Inside, rows of cages lined both walls. James's flashlight beam revealed small huddled figures, children, some as young as 5 or 6, lying motionless. They'd been drugged for transport. Between the children's cages were others containing dogs, German shepherds, Rottweilers, and Labradors like Zeus, all bearing signs of intensive training and abuse. "We need medical in here now," James called into his radio, his voice shaking with rage. This was worse than they'd imagined. Each cage represented a stolen life, a broken family. Zeus's growl cut through the darkness. James spun around, gun raised. "You should have walked away." The voice was calm, almost conversational. A figure stepped out of the shadows at the back of the cargo hold. Tall, well-dressed, with eyes that reminded James of winter frost. The ghost. He moved with casual confidence, as if the raid happening outside was merely an inconvenience. "Officer Nolan, we finally meet." His gaze shifted to Zeus. "And my lost investment returns." James kept his weapon trained on the ghost. "It's over. The whole operation is done." "Nothing's ever really over," the ghost replied, his thin lips curving into a smile. "There will always be supply and demand. Always be someone willing to pay the right price." He glanced at the cages. "For the right product." The ghost's hand moved smoothly into his jacket. "You've cost me millions, Officer Nolan. You and that dog." The weapon appeared so quickly, James barely had time to react. The ghost wasn't aiming at him. The gun was pointed directly at Zeus. A shot rang out. The gunshot echoed through the cargo hold, but Zeus was already moving. Years of training and instinct kicked in as the Labrador twisted away from the bullet's path. It wasn't a clean dodge. The round tore across his side, leaving a burning trail of red through his fur. But Zeus didn't falter. With a fierce snarl, he launched himself at the ghost. Powerful jaws clamping down on the man's gun arm. The ghost's calm facade shattered. He howled in pain as Zeus's teeth sank deep, the weapon clattering to the floor. Blood seeped through his expensive suit sleeve. James seized the moment. He charged forward, ramming into the ghost with his full weight. Both men crashed to the metal floor of the cargo hold. The ghost fought back with unexpected skill, his elbow catching James hard in the ribs. Pain exploded through James's side, but he pushed through it, struggling to pin the thrashing criminal. The ghost wasn't going down easily. He struck again, this time catching James across the jaw. Stars burst in James's vision. The ghost tried to roll away, but Zeus was there, teeth finding purchase on the man's leg. The dog dragged him back, growling deep in his throat. James recovered, throwing himself back into the fight. His fist connected with the ghost's face, snapping the man's head back. They grappled on the cold metal floor, trading blows in the dim light. James took another hit to his already aching ribs, but adrenaline kept him going. Zeus maintained his grip, giving James the advantage he needed. With a final surge of strength, James managed to flip the ghost onto his stomach. He grabbed his handcuffs and snapped them around the man's wrists, pulling them tight. "You're done," he panted. "It's over." Outside, the sounds of the raid were dying down. Radio chatter confirmed what James already knew. The operation was finished. Teams were securing suspects and freeing the trafficked children. Years of investigation, countless hours of work, all leading to this moment. James pulled the ghost to his feet, finally allowing himself to breathe. They'd done it. They'd actually done it. Then he turned and saw Zeus lying on the cargo hold floor, a growing pool of blood spreading beneath him. James's heart stopped. James's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he sped through the dark city streets. Every red light felt like torture, every second precious. In the back seat, Zeus lay stretched out on a blanket, his breathing shallow and labored. The bullet graze had torn deeper than it first appeared, and blood still seeped through the makeshift bandage the paramedic had applied. "Stay with me, buddy," James pleaded, his voice cracking. His eyes darted between the road and the rearview mirror, where he could see Zeus's chest rising and falling. "We're almost there. Just hold on." The emergency veterinary clinic's lights blazed through the night like a beacon. James screeched to a halt in front of the entrance, leaving the car running as he carefully lifted Zeus from the back seat. The dog whimpered softly and James's heart clenched. Inside, everything moved in a blur. Veterinary staff rushed forward with a gurney, whisking Zeus away through swinging doors. James stood in the waiting room, his hands and shirt stained with Zeus's blood, feeling helpless. The hours crawled by. James paced the small waiting area, too wired to sit. His mind kept replaying that moment in the cargo hold. The shot, Zeus's leap, the blood. He'd been here before, in this same clinic years ago, when Zeus was just a dying puppy in a dumpster. The parallel wasn't lost on him. Back then, he'd been a stranger to the dog. Now Zeus was his partner, his friend, his family. This time was different. This time he refused to walk away. This time, he wouldn't lose him. The sun was rising when the vet finally emerged, her surgical mask pulled down around her neck. She looked tired but wore a gentle smile. "He's going to be okay," she said. "The bullet caused significant tissue damage, but no vital organs were hit. He lost a lot of blood, but he's stable now." James let out a shaky breath, running his hands over his face. The tension he'd been holding for hours finally began to ease. "He's awake if you'd like to see him," the vet added. In the recovery room, Zeus lay on a padded bed wrapped in clean bandages. An IV line ran into his front leg, but his eyes were bright and alert. When he saw James, his tail began to wag weakly against the bed. James knelt beside him, carefully running his hand over Zeus's head. The dog leaned into his touch, and James felt tears prick at his corners of his eyes. "You really did become something great," he whispered, scratching behind Zeus's ears. "You saved those kids. You saved me. You're not just a survivor anymore. You're a hero." 2 weeks later, James sat on his front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky into brilliant oranges and pinks. Zeus lay at his feet, his wound nearly healed, while Ace lounged nearby. Both dogs were relaxed, at peace. The ghost was behind bars, his operation dismantled. The children were safe, reunited with their families. After years of darkness, they were finally free. James reached down to pat Zeus's head, smiling as the dog looked up at him with trusting eyes. Sometimes the best things in life came from the darkest places. Sometimes saving one life meant saving many more. And sometimes a tiny puppy in a dumpster could grow up to change everything. And so, we've journeyed through a deeply moving and thrilling story about the bond between a police officer and a puppy once abandoned in the cold. From a simple act of rescue, James and Zeus became inseparable partners, facing dangerous challenges together and ultimately bringing down a dangerous criminal organization. This story isn't just about saving a life, but about loyalty, perseverance, and an invaluable friendship. Zeus, from an abandoned pup, became a symbol of change and hope, and their journey together proved that sometimes the best things in life come from the smallest moments. If this story touched your heart and you want to explore more inspiring stories like it, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an exciting new video. We'll continue bringing you captivating stories full of inspiration and surprises. Share this video with your friends and loved ones to spread the message of friendship, courage, and kindness. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.